This is the Ecommerce Braintrust, a podcast about building momentum online for established consumer brands. Join our hosts and their expert guests for high-level conversations about e-commerce strategies, trends, and innovations. Access our Braintrust and boost your brand's e-commerce potential.
Welcome to the Ecommerce Braintrust podcast. I'm Julie Spear, head of retail marketplace services at Acadia. And today I'm joined by two of my favorite podcast guests, Perry and Oskar Kaszubski of Firstmovr. Today we'll be sharing some of the key takeaways from their report that they released earlier this year. That's a guide to something they're calling Omni-Category Captaincy. So today's episode, we're going to follow their map to see if maybe we'll find a treasure chest of omni-channel, omni-category knowledge. And I'll try and refrain from a lot of pirate-themed puns. With that, welcome to the podcast, Chris and Oskar. It's great to have you back.
Thank you so much for having us again.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely. Well, let's dig in. As with any of the reports that you guys release, you really find a way to have fun with theme and package it in a way that's engaging for everybody reading it. This one's really no different. Did you always have a pirate theme on your radar and you were just looking for the perfect content to match with it? Or was this one just naturally suited for it? How did you go about deciding on the theme here?
I'll say Oskar comes up with some pretty cool ideas too, but he's always very, I would say, flexible with me and letting me go with any crazy direction that pops into my head. I try to vet them though first, but we are always thinking of fun movie references. Obviously, again, make something that is important, but sometimes complex, sometimes not as sexy, a little sexier, just to break through, but to bring back the brilliant basics that for some are basics, but maybe aren't being applied as effectively, but for some aren't being done at all. Again, they might be new in the role or new as maybe there's a challenger brand that's grown up to a certain level that now is having those more mature JBP discussions and collaborations with retailers. So when we were thinking about captaincy as I would say that higher order achievement that most brands want, even if it's unofficial, right? There may not be an official title from the retailer, but that you've earned that top JBP partner is such a coveted role. We remembered that common phrase, category captain, right? Category captaincy. Naturally, it's a direct reference to captain, right? We realize you don't need to be in the Navy to be a captain, because as long as you have a ship and can sail the high seas, you are a captain. Now, you might not be recognized yet officially until you've matured your fleet of ships, but you only need the ship as Jack Sparrow, Captain Jack would say. You just need a ship to be a captain. So it kind of was a natural play, but I always like to say there's a lot of substance behind what we have. I mean, we have like textbooks of content and playbooks, but they would be textbooks if we didn't make them a little more fun. So we thought we'd have a little bit of fun here.
I love it. You're speaking to the former teacher here, which is that energy is still strong in me. And anytime that you can package content that is dense and can take a lot of effort to kind of take in, anytime you can package it in a way where you can thread a theme through and really engage your audience, I'm all for it. So well done with this one. Omni-Category Captaincy. Can you talk to me about what defines the captain of Omni-Category versus someone that's maybe just a deckhand?
When I think back to the original kind of definition of a category captain, like if we go back to old school brick and mortar, right? Historically, it was a high performing manufacturer or supplier in a particular category. That's why it was called a category captain, not like a channel captain or a retailer captain, right? It was just in snacks, in paper, in beauty, or a subcategory in beauty, depending on how the retailer broke up the departments. It was a high performance partner, but that's not enough, right? There are a lot of high growth, large share partners and big retailers. It was also an unbiased partner who collaborated directly with the retailers to share more than the average set of insights, obviously advise on shopper and consumer dynamics, obviously, or add to the ones the retailer already had, but maybe from another angle as this specialist in that area. Obviously, might beta test programs. And sometimes we're kind of anointed the more official captain title, and we're given maybe some privileges or early mover advantages, or even we're given the chance to like actually advise on the planogram. So there's this idea of category captaincy, which isn't different. in the sense of those two key pieces need to be true in today's omni-channel world. But Omni obviously adds a whole nother set of not principles, but practices, as we know well, to win on the digital shelf at Amazon or at a Walmart or a Kroger. The practices are different. But as the E and e-commerce become silent, teams need to be integrating all of this in. And again, you've still got some of the traditional brick and mortar focused folks. And then you've got a lot of the e-com folks who haven't really worked on brick and mortar, who are all merging together. And we need to bring all of these together from all elements of this. So when we laid out like what Omni-Category Captaincy is, all of these things are related, and our report is free and available to anybody who'd like to reach out. We'll send it to you, and undoubtedly we'll be launching an event soon focused more specifically on this as well. So it'll be shared with additional detail versus just our mini presentation that we've recently shared as part of one of our other events. But we kind of found 8 buckets of, very true to swabbing the decks, right? 8 buckets of, I would say, related but individual actions or initiatives or ways of working that define a category captain. And so I know we'll have a little time to talk about a few of these, but just in highlighting the 8, just so everybody knows what they are. Some of them are pretty straightforward, right? We called it under the theme, right? Tight ship. Running a tight ship is everyday excellence. That seems like a low-hanging fruit, but nobody wants to talk to you about cool things until you have your basics right. The code, the pirate code, that's the way of working, right? It's not a law, but it's a better way of establishing a JBP and an everyday cadence. Compass is your thought leadership in the industry, even beyond the retailer. Fair wins, right? Every captain wants fair wins on the open sea. That's really creating and driving and taking advantage of traffic and demand generation for your retailer. Bounty is how to drive incremental growth, not just for yourself, but for the category and for the retailer. Treasure Island is data sharing and data clean room, which is very appropriate to like those like black box opportunities, collaborating on media targeting and beyond. The last 2 are map, which is helping the retailer with their category navigation online in the same way that we try to help in store. And last but not least, we would say fly the colors is how do we actually help that UX and shopper experience? Again, we don't own it as brands, but we might be the only ones walking it with that eye for like, well, you do it this way and 3 other retailers do it this way. And as a shopper myself, this kind of feels clunky here. And there are a lot of like little examples when Oskar and I walk the shelf, we find that just they feel tactical, but if you fixed it, it might drive incrementality, right? So all of those things need to be done together to be a captain, if you will. But what's interesting is most brands are doing a few of those things, or they're doing a lot of those things and not getting a lot of credit for them. So thus they're not getting credit for their captaincy, which seems like, again, a low-hanging fruit. So I know we can dig into some of these, but there's some cool stuff here. And Oskar, I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to build here as you're thinking about what the captains we're working with today.
I think, because we're working with a lot of vendors as well as with a lot of brands to just build the overall picture of where the industry is, where it needs to go. I think the biggest challenge that we actually see is that our map in terms of where the brands should go not necessarily has the right scale. And we've seen a lot of those situations where brands think they're in a position A, they are close to the treasure, but they are actually much farther apart because they are not taking under consideration that they need to not only pay attention to their competitors as well as to their category, but just there's a broader view of categories, right? If you think about just overall CPGs, there are about 330 categories out there and they are not growing the same way. A lot of brands don't really understand this, that they might be not only behind the competitors, but they might be behind the category, but the category might be actually behind the broader category. And then that category can be actually behind CPG growth overall, right? It's very important to kind of frame this in the right way so people kind of understand this. What is the scale of the problem? But the ones that we actually constantly running to, despite that this is 2024, is that most of brands don't act upon what's going on in digital as part of the overall Omni until the actually overall share goes down. So we've seen a lot of the brands that are basically still felt that their overall share in store and online is holding steady. They don't have to do anything despite that there might be single digits or even double digits behind the category growth when it comes into digital. So that urgency to act and that captaincy really has to be kind of relooked much more broader. And that's kind of the advice that we're actually giving to all of our clients.
Yeah, you need that layer. You need to be proactive and always looking ahead and not just reacting to the lagging indicators. So excellent. One of the things that you shared in your report was a stat that 70% of sales by 2027 will be digitally influenced. Can you talk to me a bit more about what digitally influenced is and the ways that we might see it play out in the modern customer journey?
We use this stat a lot. It's a great Forrester stat. And honestly, I've seen other stats too that are very similar to that, but I really like that one. And we always want to make sure we're vetting the true story, but we always like easy stats to remember that really validate that imperative that Oskar was kind of just talking about, right? That need to act. So Forrester has said that 70% of all sales across categories globally will be digitally influenced by 2027. That is made up of 30% per their estimates of sales are in e-commerce by 2027, which makes sense based on other trajectories we've seen. And then 40%, the other part of that 70% is in-store sales that are digitally influenced. Now, this is a broad estimate, and I know some people are like, oh, well, that's by 2027. Well, to be fair, it's about 64% today is digitally influenced. So we're not that far away from the 70s. So it's not like a big number far away from now. We are here in a big number. But what's interesting, though, is Oskar and I like to argue that we actually think that almost 100% of sales are actually digitally influenced in the major channels that shoppers shop for two reasons. One, to your point about the modern shopper, consumer, customer journey, so many of us are starting online before we even get to the store, obviously. So we are digitally influenced. That digital shelf is determining what consideration set we have before we get there. Our past purchase history in grocery might be dictating a little bit of what we would buy or what brands we would be thinking of because they're so top of mind since that we're so loyal to them as a mental share of voice. When I'm in a Target, I'm using the Target app to look for deals. And I might even be using the Amazon app to target chagrin, to look for reviews if I don't see enough reviews or enough information on the Target site in the store. So shoppers are digitally influenced, and not just the digital shelf, social, traditional digital media. But there's another element, right? That 30%, if we do the math correctly, that's not digitally influenced, arguably are people that maybe it's older generations, it's people who live off the grid. I don't know. I haven't met someone who isn't really digitally influenced, but let's just say there are. I think they may be digitally influenced unbeknownst to them because, one, other shoppers who are digitally influenced are making purchase decisions in store and online that influence the assortment that's made available to those non-digitally influenced people. Arguably, the choices they have are digitally influenced. It's just not their decision-making wasn't, but what they can choose from is. And then the merchants, right, the retailers are starting to choose digital assortment, right? Digitally native brands that are winning in digital. Target is already starting to ask major CPGs to test online first, then earn your way in store. That's a lot safer than testing in 200 stores with fixed planograms versus, and then scale to 2,000, right? It's much easier if you start with online, prove that out with those best practices. If you're winning at a certain point in time, we'll let you come in store. So arguably by 2027, maybe we'll throw it out a few years, almost 100% of sales will be digitally influenced, meaning if you don't win in digital, you don't win at all. You don't even have the right to be in store. So that's kind of where this imperative is. Oskar, I know we're talking to so many different levels and we almost have to tell this story to make sure it breaks through and I don't want to say convinces them, but validates this imperative.
I think, there is still, when we actually talking to C-suite, it's still a little bit of a disbelief in terms of how important is the content in the overall omnichannel world. Some of it is, of course, that a lot of the C-suite members actually are not shoppers in store because they are too busy. They have someone else basically doing shopping for them. And I think the other problem is that we also have seen since the beginning of the inflation that the basket, a number of items has shrunk. So now every single decision that shoppers need to make, they are really considering their options because there is a lot of trade-offs that they need to make. So instead of buying maybe two products, they will look for a single product that will actually combine the usage for both of those other products. Or maybe their preference is changing. And we know, especially when it comes into Gen Z cohort, their preferences and their attitudes towards drinking alcohol, towards, for example, soft drinks, is completely changing and it's revamping their categories. And some of them not necessarily even driven by any TikTok trends, It's just the behavioral changes, the issues with housing. I still talk that for our generation, probably the biggest assets will be our physical residence, because that physical residence might have to, in the future, satisfy needs of multi-level family in terms of that, just because of what's getting out of hand in terms of where we are. So I think we still have to kind of talk about the role of the content and the role of the influence of the content. And then what Chris and I often actually are talking about it is, even if the people are not influenced by content, a lot of the times they are influenced by opinions of their friends. And those friends might be actually digitally influenced, right? So we really have to kind of understand this, like from a perspective of learning about the product, that information sooner or later has to come to everybody. So from that perspective, it's not really far-fetched to say that the content, that basically digital content influences everyone.
Yeah, because what you're mapping out clearly is there's the direct digital influence, the first degree, and then there's the slight removal, the second, third, 6 degrees of digital influence.
Exactly.
When you look at it from all the angles, you can see that 70% is actually a conservative estimate. Well, let's talk a little bit about the specific subcategories that you've identified that lead to captaincy. I want to start with the code, with the ways of working. You define this as really stemming from like the JBP process, and whether you're working as a siloed JBP process versus integrating JBP process or an integrated process. Can you talk me through a generalized supplier that knows the code and how they're approaching this part of their business successfully?
Sure. One point of just an interesting aside here related to this, because we've been doing a lot of trainings on this and helping people through this process. Just for like definition purposes, you can disagree with us, but this helps us organize chaos. We hear a lot about JBP, we hear JVC, and then we hear captaincy, right? So they're all related, but I always like to organize them. JBP is the joint business plan, which generally is a 1 year or multi-year, but it's a shorter term vessel to get us where we want to go. So I would like to think it's the ship, if you will, that gets us where we want to go. JVC is joint value creation, right? A buzzword, yes, but it's arguably the destination. Maybe it's that treasure that we're hoping to get to at the end. And it's an ongoing, it's our purpose, it's our vision. We always hope to be creating value for ourselves and our retailers. And then the captain is the who, right? It's us leading on that process. So, because sometimes you hear like people toss out JVC, JBP, and I think it's easy to say those words and not know what they mean. So I like to first organize that. But the ways of working, some people would say, well, ways of working are just my everyday, day-to-day account management with a key retailer. Definitely. That's part of it. And you may not be the top JBP or the official captain today, and that's okay. But you should be acting like one. Dress to impress, right? Dress for the job you want. Act like the partner you want to be. We have a whole like JBP planning process, and some of these are like logical steps, but then breaking them down into what needs to be true and playbooks for those. But we generally would say, obviously, and once you start doing this, you don't have to repeat all the steps over again from scratch. You'd be building off last year's and so on. But one, you've got to identify and re-identify your retailers' omni and digital connectivity on their own teams and their capability maturity, right? What can they do? What do they want to do? You need to understand their objectives and KPIs and yours. You then obviously want to prioritize that every day with that tight ship needs to be true. I've seen some amazing ideas from partners, from manufacturers who bring them, but they're out of stock. So they have a systemic issue of availability. Nobody wants to talk to you about that sexy, cool shopper marketing program if you can't supply the product that would be in the program. That sounds obvious, but everybody wants the sexy, big, shiny idea and sometimes haven't fixed the everyday fundamentals. So that is an important part of that. And yes, that requires day-to-day blocking, tackling, meetings, ongoing weekly connects wherever you can, monthly reviews, quarterly reviews, etc. But then more for the JBP part, like that annual planning process, you want to identify and prioritize short-term and long-term joint value creation opportunities. It's not to create frameworks, but we have a whole framework on JVC and areas of value you can create in the plan. You align those, obviously, the ones that align with what they want to achieve and you want to achieve, and create joint accountability, establish a communication and meeting cadence, and then consistently review. So I have like a whole list of all these types of meetings that teams should really be having. And it feels like if anyone needs another meeting, but these are really helpful, right? There's kind of 3 layers of day-to-day account management. That's just the day-to-day blocking and tackling. Then you have the annualized planning meetings that help make sure that you're engaged in aligning on the thing that then has specific joint value initiatives that you'll want to meet on separately with the appropriate parties. So at the end of the day, I mean, if you work on account, you're probably doing some of this already. So this isn't really more. It's about, are they all linked together to create the ultimate outcome that we want? And we see a lot of brands doing this. In fact, it's almost like you show me your cards, I show you my card. So when we show our playbook, a lot of times, like some of the leading brands have their own playbook that's almost the same. And then maybe theirs is added something because they've troubleshooted something that's really interesting as a nuance. And then they add a step from ours. But that way of working is important because then all of these other things don't have a venue to share. How am I going to share some of the other buckets of value with you in captaincy when I don't even have a way to bring them up to you without it seeming like a one-off or a shiny object? So it's about creating that cadence so that top to top, all the way down to day has a way to engage and bring these up. And I would say percolate them up. That code is an important way of working that should be flexible, just like pirates, but that will enable more of the value creation, more of that bounty and the map and the compass and all these other things that we'll talk to as well.
I appreciate how you're giving a lot of attention to clarifying the language, getting into the specifics of meeting types and cadences. Those are such foundational variables that you said it at one point too. It can seem common sense. It can seem obvious, but I feel like in day to day and as you're moving through business, it's that obvious. It's those basics that often go to the wayside. And that is what creates fractures that lead to issues down the road. So it's really important to spend the time on the specifics, being clear on the language, being clear on what the intent and purpose is of each meeting so that your foundation is strong, and then you can captain the ship. Well, let's move into the next section, which is the compass. And it's the idea that thought leadership and innovation are important to being a leader in a given category. How do you typically see this play out? Does it come from like brands developing good relationships with retailers and being open to betas? How should a brand consider positioning themselves to be kind of leading the industry from a thought leadership and innovation standpoint alongside a retailer?
So I'll start. Oskar has some good examples too. I'll say what's important is so I think sometimes when we think thought leadership is an interesting buzzword, because again, obviously you want to be able to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. But a lot of companies, either they haven't operationalized like the PR around cool things that they're doing, or they're afraid to share too much, or they just have like one kind of nixing policy that keeps them from anybody from really sharing. And we see some amazing leaders at companies in e-commerce and beyond who aren't allowed to say anything. Again, not to give away proprietary confidential stuff, but not even to share stuff that we can clearly see is happening in the market. So some of this is an internal culture or system enabling select sharing of things or select PR, or maybe promoting some of this stuff more intentionally. But there are a lot of small things that aren't so small when they're blown up. And there's kind of two parts to this. One, it's by default, a lot of times to do anything with thought leadership that retailers are going to care about, it's going to require that you do it with a retailer. But I remember in the early days of e-commerce, when we first started at Reckitt on my team, we had like 20 retailers that we thought all had equal opportunity to grow as big as each other. And very quickly, we realized not all of them were going to be the same, right? So Amazon quickly was rising, and Costco in the early days, just by nature of their loyal shopper and their larger pack and value sizes, kind of leaped forward even before they were focused on e-commerce. But I remember like Peapod, or now Stop and Shop Delivers as an example, was honestly one of our best partners. They were big because they were an early mover in e-commerce, but they didn't end up being the biggest because they were regional, but they were the most collaborative partner. And so we kind of found an opportunity to like create joint value with them, create thought leadership things, examples that were in market as news, as PR, and bring those back to other retailers who also saw them and say, we could do this with you too. So sometimes it's finding like the innovation partner role, not just a tech partner, third party, but also a retailer who kind of knows that they're not going to be your number one in size, but can be your number one in commercial innovation, and sharing that. But the other thing I'll say, like I said, Oskar has seen a lot of cool examples too. They can be small, I want to say small, rather niche things that actually can be very powerful. I give you an example. Unilever, for many years now, this goes back many years, Oliver Bradley on their global e-commerce design team for the digital shelf has done some amazing work in partnership with retailers and the University of Cambridge in the UK to develop mobile hero image best practices. And they publish them. So by doing that publicly in partnership with some select retailers and then another third-party credible institution, they are literally synonymous with digital shelf excellence. Now, they are good at what they do, but they almost don't even have to be good at the rest of the digital shelf. They're just perceived as being really good because they've got real research, real results, real stats. So the good thing is they actually can walk the walk and talk the talk too. But even if they were fooling all of us, they've shown thought leadership and it's out there, but then they bring that into their retail discussions, among many other things that they do. So that thought leadership can be a number of things that creates a little bit of FOMO of like, well, I didn't do that with you. But you have to bring that in as part of your ways of working, that code, to make sure that they're seeing it. Because some buyers wouldn't even pay attention to this stuff until you show it to them, right? So that's an important one. But Oskar, what other types of thought leadership do you see?
I'll tell you, the ones that we actually constantly looking at it is, of course, the PDP content. And I would actually argue that when you actually look at the PDP content across any retailers, it's still very transactional. If you actually think about it, it's, for example, any new trends, they basically manifest themselves as new products. But if you actually look at all of those PDP pages, like they literally speak very transactionally. You could not tell if this is a content that is built for somebody that is new to category or maybe that is already maybe lapsed user, etc. Right? It's a very transactional. It's almost like the content is built for AI to make sure the AI chose the right product, but it's a little bit dehuman. So I think from a retailer perspective, there is a little bit of a better understanding in terms of that millennials' needs and Gen Z needs are different. How do we actually differentiate that content? How do we better personalize? I would argue that actually as digital e-commerce leaders within the last 20 years, we did kind of fail on personalization. We were talking about personalization, but that personalization never truly manifested. And hopefully with things like generative AI, that will finally manifest so we can have actually different content sets for people that are new to category, or maybe they are very well versed in the category, maybe they are lapsed, etc. Right? So there is a lot of those examples because I think retailers are basically struggling. They are talking about the category trends, but they are not focusing, for example, enough on shopper missions. They are not focusing enough on demographics, behavior, and they are barely scratching trends. And I think holistically, that's a massive opportunity for us as an industry to kind of take the social content that is and the social conversation that are happening out there and starting to merge it together with the retailer content, because retailers can realize that they are actually in a content business too, as content publishers, to get people to buy it on their side.
That's a really interesting twist on this element. Very interesting. It's kind of a perfect segue to some of the ideas that you shared in the next section of the report that I want to dig into, which is the idea of bounty, which refers to all of the methods that can be used to drive incremental growth via innovative category management. What are some of the more inventive ways that you're seeing brands drive incremental bounty, and how can this be beneficial to both the brand and the retailer ultimately?
Everybody says they want incremental growth, but they really only are designing their go-to-market strategy around growth, like just all growth. So they don't really know what incremental is, right? I don't mean that to a blanket statement. I don't want people pitchforking my house here. Some of you really are doing this because we can see good examples of it. But I think the challenge, the way we've seen it, and this really brings up kind of bounty includes a couple different things, but it really, one of the big areas for us is this idea of Catman 3.0, because category management was done in brick and mortar when we hit a level of mature in-store sales growth. And we were looking for ways to attract new buyers, get lapsed people back, build the category, bring new people in, obviously build baskets through a number of means, drive more trips than you were originally going to do. This was literally what like Circana and Nielsen used to teach brand managers in terms of household penetration, dollars per trip, trips per shopper, right? This isn't new, but it's like it got forgotten for like the last 10 to 15 years, because for the last 10 to 15 years, we saw massive growth in e-commerce. There's a shift and early movers jumped on the capabilities, right? The hows. How am I going to drive growth? And have been trying to perfect that. And like literally, Oskar and I see a lot of these strategy documents, like these annual plans or 2030 plans, and they're not bad, but it's like the pillar of growth is like digital shelf leadership. And I know it's like a one pager, so it's going to be a little lofty and then there'll be details, but around what is that digital shelf leadership? Like everything, you can't be everything to everyone. You got to pick an audience by SKU or by brand and own that audience. And maybe that's your current shoppers and you're going to maximize those people. Or maybe it's new shoppers and you're going to bring people in. Or, hey, you're so mature and you're number one, you're going to step up and generously help the category bring new people in. But it's about thinking about your brand, your SKU, your retailer, your market position. And Oskar and I originally called this smarter growth, thinking of specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound, smart goals. But we've actually grown this into something we call the growth genome, which is another like subset of captaincy, right? It's this category management 3.0. But it's the idea of every brand, every category, every retailer, every SKU even has a different DNA of opportunity of growth, right? The same Tide laundry detergent might have a basket building opportunity at Walmart, but a new shopper opportunity at Target. I'm just making that up. We'd have to look at the data, but there are a lot of cool best practices for designing for that incrementality you want across content, your assortment, all the P's, right? You can use the P's, which are the hows, to design around intentional incremental growth goals. And there are 12 of those you can design around to get incrementality. But it does also come back to the data, which Oskar teased at the beginning. And we've been working on some work with Circana and Profitero. Oskar, maybe you can share a little more on that.
Yeah, so the thing what it is the problem that we have in e-commerce that we have always not enough data, right? Or that data basically is partial. We might have good data for top retailers, and it's actually very visible when you actually look at the category growth, that there is a correlation with the retailers that actually we have good data on, that they are growing a little bit more versus the other ones. They are lagging, right? So there's definitely a big correlation there. But I think, to be frank, one of the challenges that we actually see within the industry is that when we actually looking at those different data sets, people are still freaking out. Their question is this the right data? We still go into kind of this mode of that the one number can actually throw the entire deck away. And we are constantly not thinking is that this is really an iterative process, that we are trying to create a data set as good as possible. And where we don't have the data, we can still apply some of the strategies that would make sense based on the data from another retailer to be able to do it. But the key is really the nuance, which Chris mentioned. The strategy cannot be that the strategy for Amazon, for Walmart, for Target is going to be the same. It cannot be even for the same different brands. It has to be on a SKU level because there are different opportunities. And for brands that can actually react to this data as quickly as possible, of course, all the CPGs are slow-moving ship, but in a relative fashion, these are the ones that can actually then take advantage of some of those trends and being able to basically use their data to their advantage. But it's still a problematic that even in 2024, we are struggling. And especially one of the challenges that we see is if a CPG is a Nielsen shop, and Circana might have a better data, they will never use it because we are a Nielsen shop. And the same thing goes in for Circana. If they're a Circana shop, they will say, oh, we don't like anything from Nielsen, right? So they like to have one consistent data set. And sometimes it doesn't make sense to have it. It's just like in terms of the growth. So
yeah, you need to be agnostic to get a full picture through the data. Absolutely. Let's dig into one final category here. Let's talk about the colors. You describe this as the idea that all retailers have their own set of content rules, platform, assortment standards, search algorithms, all the things that make them special, unique, and just lovely to navigate amongst. But really, these are still areas where the brands play a huge role in how the customer experience plays out, given a retailer's reliance on the brand to produce product and brand-specific content very cleanly. Could you maybe give some examples of where this goes well and where it has gone wrong, and how brands should be thinking about and optimizing for this interplay amongst channels?
This one, honestly, like every one of these buckets of captaincy is its own separate playbook, its own separate set of trainings and learnings and advisory. And the reason I say that is not as selling those things or complicating it. It's that every one of these things was its own thing until we realized, like, hey, nobody's talking about captaincy overall in this omni space. We need to group these together. So there is so much that can be unpacked under each one. And we do already work with so many brands on pieces of this, but now it's like, how do you sum these up? But that colors piece, which again is all about that UX and shopper experience, as mentioned when I first kind of gave the overview, that isn't something you own, right? You don't own the site structure To be fair, your buyer doesn't even own that. Usually it's a web manager. There's a web merchant team or merchandising team or a site management team. I mean, they can call it all different things. Obviously IT, others like coders, all this. There are all these things behind the scenes. And obviously some of these sites are in-house developed. Some of these are like leveraging different platforms, maybe outsource some of it for some of the smaller retailers or early day retailers. But long story short, you don't have to own it to audit it, right? It's a little bit of like at the airport, see something, say something. If you just see random things and say something randomly all the time, it's going to be like, Chris and Oscar always bring me one-off tactical things that don't seem to make a difference. So you have to, part of the opportunities, you almost have to do that urgent, important matrixing of things. But the idea is walk the shelf, right? First of all, as you're shopping for something else, hopefully you shop your own category too, but you might not be the consumer. How was that consumer experience? Where was the friction? Where was the issue? It could be all the way from pre-search or inspiration to reviewing the product, to actually buying the product, to receiving the product, to using the product, to also returning the product. Or I had a DoorDash order from a restaurant yet last night. Obviously, it can be any type of experience from a last miler or a retailer, and they missed one of my items. DoorDash has made this so simple. It did stink, though, that we didn't get the dessert for my kids for our meal. Yeah, we can cry about it later, but that was a frustration. But within 5 seconds, I had my refund back to my card. I don't feel like I lost in total, but there was a minor loss, but they tried to make up for it, right? So quickly, without any extra friction. But it's going through that as a shopper and then trying to apply that back. Like, how does that work for my category? And so both of us are constantly walking shelves and screenshotting things and auditing for our partner brands. And sometimes it's something small. And I'm not picking on these two retailers, but one that I used in our recent presentation on this to show you an example. When I went on Walmart in a market where you could buy Bev Out category products, I clicked through to the main Bev Out page, right, for all wine, spirits, and beer. And then Walmart does a really nice job of merchandising it for you to like help you. Do you want to shop by type? Do you want to shop by occasion or by needs? Some really cool organization. So I clicked into occasion, and then it gave me like 24 different, if I remember correctly, like 24 different occasions that then I could click through. Really cool setup. They probably got coached a little bit by some of the big Bev Out players, but they did a really nice job. But right below that, there's this like merchandising banner ad that says shop all beer, wine, and spirits, which links me back to that main page, but not to like, hey, like go back. Do you mean to come here, go back? Just almost like I had never seen it before. Well, clearly I had, because I couldn't have gotten to that page had I not already gone through total beer, wine, and spirits. So to me, that's missing an opportunity. Maybe we should be talking about organic or non-alcohol or low carb or something unique, like call out, hey, by occasion, but remember, there are some need states that aren't occasion based here because we don't want to lose you from thinking of, oh yeah, I want it for this occasion, but I'm also thinking non-alcohol. So my point is some of this is subjective, but that feels like a miss. Like we could use that space for something better. And Bev Out players can't pay Walmart to do something there, but they could coach them. That was one example. The other one was interesting on Kroger. I clicked through to the natural and organic section, and they had like kind of hero links out to the subcategories of different departments that have organic or natural products. Then right below it, they have their little carousel of coupons that you could clip. None of them were natural and organic products, which is a little bit funny to me, right? Because I went to that page to filter out everything else, only looking at natural and organic. And I definitely want to save money, but then I'm going right back to maybe the less healthy products or the non-natural. So those are little things. And maybe for you, you'd say, well, that didn't really impact me. I'm the manufacturer. That wasn't a big deal for me. But it's that kind of unbiased recommendation. And I might say if that's not urgent for you, I'd put that into a bucket of things you bring as an overall recommendation later on. If it's actually impacting your performance or something, that might be a little more urgent and important. But I would pool some of those things into kind of a parking lot and organize and then do almost like a, hey, I walked your site and I identified a couple friction points. I wanted to share that with you. It shows thought leadership. It shows that you care, you're unbiased, you want to help everyone. But then you could also, at a later point, say, and I also assessed some other retailers and I did a crawl, walk, run, or a good, better, best. And I kind of found that you're sitting in that better, but there's some ways you could be best. So good job on being better than some of your peers. Here's their screenshot, but here's how you could do it. Or have we ever tried this? Or can we try that with you? Obviously, it helps if you can do something with them, but it's also important that you just highlight gaps because you know what? Those people will look like heroes when they bring awesome insights and recos back to the teams that help too, because everyone wins, even if it's not their role and responsibility. So some of that shopper experience is thinking about it from what you experience, trying to sit in the mind of the shopper through your category, and then just constantly walking. And if your mind isn't one of those that like is always looking for problems or like the what ifs, sit with somebody who does. Sit with a peer who's one of those people. Like Oskar is such a great wonder person. Like, I mean, he's already planned for how we're going to colonize other planets. You know what? I want to be with him when we need to leave, because one day we might, and we might be living forever. I want to be on a ship with Oskar because I want to also make sure that we're ready to go to the next planet after Mars when that gets overpopulated too. Get with somebody who looks at things that way so that they can find it. 20 minutes, 30 minutes, you'll have like a whole list of things of why did they do that way? Or couldn't that be done better this way? And then bring those, obviously organize them, but bring them back as a piece of thought leadership.
I love this. You're hitting on some really important things. One, I find huge value in walking the store, shopping the shelves. It's critical to understand, because otherwise you can get so stuck in the weeds of the back end and your ideas and all of this, but you need to see how it's actually playing out. And two, you're hitting on how to be a good partner, how to align yourself and be on the same side as your retailer. And it's human nature. We are all more likely to work with somebody and to find the benefit for somebody that feels like they're on our side. You're hitting on some fundamentals there. And I think you also touched on maybe an aspect of one of my favorite books of The 6 Working Geniuses by Pat Lencioni.
I love that very much. I
heard you drop wonder in there, awesome. But that could be a conversation for another day.
Yeah, so Oskar and I both took that quiz and we were like, he's a wonder invention person and I'm an invention discernment person. So we're really complementary. But then we were like, it's amazing that Firstmovr is almost 5 years old because we obviously have people behind us that help get all the work done.
You need that tenacity in there.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let's kind of close this out. Oskar, I'm hoping maybe you can help me with the final question here. And Chris, you hit on this, that each of these sections is like a massive report in and of itself. There's so much for each of the subcategories. So if I'm a brand that's trying to figure out like, okay, how do I really grow toward captaincy? Where would you suggest they focus on first? What's the starting point? If you can only zero in on one area, what would your suggestion be?
Just to give you a little bit of a background, because I actually have a degree in computer science, philosophy, and history, and that will explain my answer to this. Philosophically, the biggest two sins that we actually see is twofold. Number one is brands, as I mentioned before. As long as they are not losing share in Omni, they don't want to do anything when it comes into, for example, working on digital. Having that understanding that they are not only competing within broader category, but actually there is an overall industry and there are 330 categories and they can actually get those lessons also outside of their own existing categories, absolutely super important, right? So having that kind of awareness where they are, where they need to go. The second sin that we actually see that brands actually are a little bit in a despair. They basically think that they've done everything, that they know everything, and they cannot do anything more. And I think that's a massive sin within our industry because we are basically seeing a lot of the leaders said, well, this is 2024. I've trained people on e-commerce, dabbling into AI. There's not really nothing I can do, right? So basically, like we're almost giving up on trying something new and kind of testing new approaches. And the way I kind of explain to people is the winners that I basically see, and that's going to go back to medieval Europe history, is actually, I don't know if many people know it, that England had actually one of the smallest populations on the whole European continent. English people within medieval Europe were less than 3%. France had 5 times more people. Spain had 6 times more people in terms of the population, but they still managed to massively grow their country. Of course, some of it is growing by colonization, expansion, but they did a lot with fewer people. So the quality of people, the ideas really did matter. And the other example that I always give is Portugal. When Portugal was only focusing on Europe, because of their geographical location, that was the last stop of Europe. Like nobody wanted to go to Portugal because it was too far. You had to go through France, Spain, etc. And the way they kind of reposition themselves is they said, we are not the last stop of Europe. We are the connecting stop between Asia and Europe, right? So suddenly, from the last stop, they found themselves to be in the epicenter of the global trade. And I think, we as brands, we need to think broadly in terms of our positioning. And if we don't like the deck of cards that is being kind of dealt to us, we need to find a new deck. We need to find a new table to play in. And I think some of those thinking needs to happen because this is a highly competitive world. We are not only competing with brands that have been around for many years. There's a lot of up and coming brands. There's a lot of marketplace brands that are much more quicker, agile. We constantly have to kind of reframe in terms of our growth. So having that right mindset and building that right map in terms of the strategy is absolutely critical.
That is incredible. That's life advice right there, as well as commerce advice. It's all about the framing and how you can frame the issue, the opportunity, and then that charts your map forward. So amazing. I really, really enjoyed our conversation today. As always, I learned so much when I talked to both of you. Any teasers of themes or content that you're focusing on next?
We just did our Smarter Partnership event actually this week where we shared this, but we had some awesome partners from the Digital Shelf Institute and beyond to share their different perspectives on best-in-class partnership, which complemented this really nicely. So if you didn't get a chance to attend, we're happy. It was a free event. We'll get you the recording that you can reach out to us. We normally share it with those who registered, but we'll get it to anybody who missed it. We can give you a copy of our category captaincy presentation to show you that kind of framework that we've been talking through. And we're going to likely do kind of a dedicated captaincy event coming up. We just haven't put it on the calendar, but it will come. It'll be free. We see a huge opportunity to become more of a podcast as well, to actually go talk to the captains out in the space. So that captains podcast should be coming soon as well. And again, all of our resources are free for brands to tap into. And you can get all of this at firstmovr.com/events if you want the events, or all of our content's on the homepage. But you can also reach out to Oskar or me at oscar@firstmovr.com or chris@firstmovr.com. And we'd love to help you officially or unofficially in any way we can as you sail those 7 seas and become the next captain.
Well, and I'll be sure to link a lot of these resources in the show notes for this episode. And I am a sucker for a podcast, so I look forward to the podcast coming out on this. Thank you both for your time today and look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.